Welcome back to Talzion's tentative trio of reviews, where we continue our journey into the backlog of Supergiant Games, this time covering their second title, Transistor. Bastion was a tough act to follow for Supergiant Games. It being received as positively as it was. The team wanted to make a better game as a follow-up, while also differentiating the new title enough from Bastion, and this apparently took its toll on the production of the game itself, which took a while to get off the ground in the first place. There's an interesting no-clip documentary on it if you're interested. I would argue that they might very well have succeeded in that sentiment of making a better, fresh game. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Transistor. In Transistor, you play as a Red, a wildly popular singer caught up in a nefarious plot that saw her almost killed. At the last moment, her partner stepped in and was killed in her stead. His trace, or soul, being absorbed into the weapon itself, called the Transistor, which allows him to still communicate with Red through the Transistor itself. With Red having lost both her voice and her lover in this attack, she vows to return that which she lost by enacting revenge on the people who did this to her, the Camerata. This all takes place in a futuristic cyberpunk setting, with an apocalyptic grey goo type flood washing over the city all the while, processing everything they find, which are the enemies that block your path on the way to revenge. Transistor is a strange game. A lot of aspects are recognizable from Bastion, but even more is completely unique to it, not even reincorporated in later titles either. Of course, visually, the game is still drop-dead gorgeous, with the entire game essentially taking place in a single night in this futuristic but not quite looking city, with all of the colors being accentuated by mock artificial lighting. I guess you could call it a clean cyberpunk setting. There's no decaying corpses or toxic grimy back alley smokestacks or anything. You know, like those dystopias where everything looks good on the outside but something feels rotten regardless. I think they might have mentioned Art Nouveau in that no-clip documentary as well. On the technical side, the game has had more issues than I had with Bastion somehow. The resolution only goes up to 1080p as opposed to the 2K even Bastion had. This might be linked to the hand-drawn nature of the game, even if Bastion itself was also a hand-drawn game, so I'm not entirely sure what the issue might be here, but it was still surprising nonetheless. Trying to alt-tab out of the game also had some issues, though the game never crashed outright or anything. Anyways, aside from the gorgeous visuals, we of course have a stunning soundtrack to go with it. Once again with the same names behind it, Darren Korb and Ashley Barrett. The vocal tracks here are beautiful, and I still listen to them regularly.
When you speak, I hear silence. Every word a defiance. I can hear, oh, I can hear.
Hey, let's just go. Come on, just go. Just, yeah.
The music has a very cool integration with the gameplay itself as well, with the music shifting to a more subdued version whenever you're planning out your turn, with the added humming from it as well, which makes it all very good as a package. Narration, once again, rests on the very capable shoulders of Logan Cunningham, leading you throughout the game as the Transistor itself, since the player protagonist in Red is once again completely silent, since she literally lost her voice and all. The enemy in Transistor is known as the Process, a sort of machine grey goo hive mind with no sentience. It seemingly mindlessly eats away at the city, processing the colorful skyline of Cloudbank into a white shadow of itself. Later down the line, you'll learn their initial goal was to stop you specifically, but it kind of got out of control, so to speak, but we'll get to that later. Gameplay-wise, Transistor stands out from its siblings, as it is, so far, the only Supergiant game that uses a real-time turn-based combat system. You can initiate a turn whenever you want, as long as the action bar is filled up. All actions you queue up execute very rapidly in sequence, not quite instantly, but near enough that it usually makes no difference, though there are exceptions. When your turn is on cooldown, however, you can't do a shit except walk around trying to avoid enemy attacks. You can use your abilities, called functions, it's a programming thing, outside of a turn, but only when the bar is filled up already, or when you use a specific function upgrade. These functions themselves are limited by a memory or skill point cap, as well as limited upgrade slots you can unlock more of by leveling up. This turns combat into, for the most part, shitting and pissing your pants while waiting for the bar to fill up again. And this is the biggest flaw in the entire game to me, at least until you find a way to deal with it efficiently. There is one function in particular you can always use outside of a turn called Jaunt. You can use Jaunt on its own, which is a dash, to make it easier to zip around and escape enemy attacks. This is still difficult, since there's always a period where you stand still after you've actually dashed, but at least makes it more manageable to try and stay out of the reach of the process. Alternatively, you can put Jaunt in an upgrade slot for a different function, so you can use that one to fend off enemies instead, albeit a lot less efficiently. Or do it the other way around and upgrade the Jaunt itself, like making it so you leave behind a low health decoy from where you dashed. This usually lures enemies away from the real you, allowing you to stay out of harm's way for usually long enough to recharge a turn, or at least to prevent yourself from dying. Experimenting with all of these different combinations of function and function upgrades is the real meat of the game here, and the game regularly throws different enemies or enemy combinations at you to keep it interesting, as well as keeping you on your toes. There's two systems that promote this experimenting even further. Firstly, if you lose all of your HP in a fight, you lose the most expensive function in terms of memory you have equipped. This function and its eventual upgrades become overloaded and unusable for at least a checkpoint or two. This obviously forces you to try something new to fill up those lost slots, provided you can still finish off the enemy with your limited arsenal in the initial encounter, of course. Secondly, due to what functions are lore-wise being the traces of actual people that the Transistor has absorbed, they themselves have background information associated with them. This information is limited at first, but gets expanded on if you use that function in one of three different ways: as an active function, in an upgrade slot for another function, or as a passive upgrade for yourself. Using a function in these three different ways unlocks all of the background information on the person whose trace represents the function. Using it literally means beat one fight with it in a specific slot, so it's pretty easy to get those out of the way, provided you can actually win those fights in the first place. So aside from the obvious fun in trying out new things and new combinations, the game very much promotes you trying out new loadouts, with enemy encounters also being varied enough that there's no single win-all combination necessarily. Since there's PvE enemies, there's a lot of enemies, so you need AoE, sometimes you need stuns or whatever. There's also a backdoor area you can find from time to time after beating the first boss, which provides some relaxation and reprieve for Red herself and allows you to try out different challenges to test your skills. These feel like a hybrid between the weapon trials and who knows where fights from Bastion, but different enough that they bring something new. Especially the planning challenges. These challenges vary from just surviving for a set amount of time to killing all enemies in a single turn with a set loadout of functions.
All these guys are gonna pop, right? Now.
All these different challenges are very cool and interesting, taking place in a wildly different area as well, which helps to differentiate it from the regular combat encounters in Cloudbank itself. Aside from the challenges, there's also a general practice area, where you can test out different loadouts on enemy dummies, so you don't have to go and get killed to try out something new. There's no real extrinsic rewards to be found here, however, aside from music tracks you can play on the jukebox here, as well as some achievements for beating the different challenges. The enemies themselves are an interesting bunch, with a compact but diverse roster, as I've alluded to already. There aren't as many enemy types here as in Bastion or Hades, but since you're always fighting the same enemy, they complement each other extraordinarily well, with enough variety to keep you on your toes, and promoting a well thought out kit, with every enemy killed dropping a cell you need to pick up to prevent them from respawning, similarly to the way enemies in Elysium work in Hades. The enemy's power doesn't stop there, however. Each enemy type evolves over the course of the game, acquiring new abilities as their versions get upgraded, with the process itself growing stronger and presumably learning and adapting all the while. Fetch processes, for example, the dog-looking enemies. They run up and bark at you, doing damage. Their 2.0 version gains a hunting cloak, making them undamageable and untargetable until they attack themselves, which is as annoying as it sounds. And their 3.0 version stuns you with every attack, which is also as annoying as it sounds. 3 fetches can easily stunlock you if you're herded in a corner, for example, so you need to play around that by not being as stupid as I am. Every enemy type goes through these different upgrade phases and they become real forces to be reckoned with. Even then, just like in Bastion, there is an added system that allows you to up the difficulty of encounters called limiters. These provide added challenges like cells being shielded or harder hitting enemies, and provides an increase in experience gain as a trade-off. Even the sound this menu uses sounds similar to the Bastion one. Since combat is all there is gameplay-wise, aside from minimal exploring and interacting with some terminals, the myriad different gameplay styles this system makes possible is very welcome, and getting to max level allows you to use any combination you want, even with duplicate functions and not being limited by a locked slots or a low memory cap. There are, of course, some flaws to be found, aside from my major gripe with how the turn cooldown is handled. Mainly the issue with the turn planning itself is the lack of clarity. For example, if I execute a function in the planning phase, it tells whether you actually would hit the enemy with your function and for how much damage, as well as some added factors like whether they'll be stunned or if your attack would count as a backstab. These numbers don't always add up, and sometimes you miss an enemy when you should have hit one, or vice versa. I assume these issues mainly stem from the fact you don't instantly perform every action, like I said before, so enemies can still pivot and move a tiny bit, which might constitute a miss from time to time perhaps. But there is a clear inconsistency here, which could cost you dearly. The whole point of planning is so you can assume some things happen with a 100% certainty, and this is simply not really possible in Transistor. As for the minimal exploration I mentioned, there are interactable objects scattered around, mainly consisting of terminals. These provide some extra insights into this world and the characters, and showcases some more of the dynamic voice lines Supergiant is known for. They're obviously not on the level of Hades yet here, but you never feel alone with Transistor guy always having something to say. Transistor is quite a short game, even shorter than Bastion, counting the optional challenges as well. That isn't to say there's nothing to enjoy here, of course. The real challenge arguably starts in New Game Plus, because the enemy compositions keep getting more complex, instead of them just hitting harder. This also means the story moves at quite a rapid pace, so everything from here on out will basically be spoiler territory. So if you like what you've seen and heard here, definitely give the game a try if you haven't yet. In any case, let's take a look at the story of Transistor.
Back to those 2-bit camerata pieces of trash. Look, whatever you're thinking, do me a favor. Don't let me go.
The story and plot are quite a bit more to unpack than the relative simplicity of Bastion or Hades. The game takes place in a single city, Cloudbank, where seemingly everything is possible. Its people desire constant change and novelty, with the city itself apparently shifting to meet those desires. As in, literally, buildings change a ton over time, according to some voice lines, with later reveals showing that a process has been working behind the scenes to make all of this possible. It's also implied that the process, and by extension the Transistor itself, needs creative minds to feed on to make the whole process more efficient, as is evidenced by the traces already in the Transistor, which translate to the functions you unlock by leveling up. The way the different terminal posts are worded gives the setting as a whole this weird too positive for real life vibe, which brings to mind that clean cyberpunk setting I mentioned, like one of those Black Mirror episodes. Now, what exactly the process or the Transistor are isn't exactly clear, except that they're definitely linked to one another. The Camerata were in control of both and experimented on both as well, according to notes you find in the limiters among other sources. They were found, however, not made. This could mean a few things. Maybe the Transistor is some sort of alien artifact, with the process being linked to it in some way, since early enemies look more alien than the later ones, with the change happening over time as the process consumes more and more of the city, and presumably its inhabitants. The Transistor itself is, or contains, a sort of virtual world on top of that, with every trace you find being stored on it, as well as a climactic fight being inside of this space as well. There are a lot of hints that take it in a different direction, however, and the more I think about it, the more I agree. The city of Cloudbank is itself a virtual world, with the transistor being what gives a person access to the back end of this virtual world, which allowed the Camerata to change the city on a whim even better than before, presumably. The transistor is referred to as a brush by one of the Camerata who knows more about the transistor than you, and while you/Red use it exclusively for combat, it is designed as something else entirely, as evidenced by its shape. That would also explain the presence of traces in the first place being akin to player data or something, as well as the backdoor area being a literal sandbox. There's also the way physics break down towards the end in some places, and the way death is described as going to the country, which lent credence to this theory. Another clue might also be the whole reason why the assassination attempt on Red failed in the first place, with Red being targeted because of her unique voice and perspectives and whatnot. Something about her music was akin to magical for the citizens of Cloudbank, it seems. The whole reason the Camerata killed the wrong person was because, apparently, Transistor Guy wasn't really registered in the massive databanks the Camerata have control over, which you pass by through the game as well. There's something called selection that all citizens of the city go through, kind of a role-choosing type of deal, I suppose, and Transistor Guy seems to be the only one who hasn't done this for some reason. This could literally be a type of class selection at the start of a game or something similar, as the function file on Transistor Guy doesn't know what to do with his data, meaning this is an unexpected error, of course. I think it's also mentioned on a terminal somewhere that hundreds of thousands of people have vanished. This could simply mean they were consumed by the process, of course, but it could also mean those people simply logged off or left this virtual world when they saw the threat the process posed and witnessed their virtual paradise crumble to dust. The final news message you find, at least, mentions that the citizens are unwilling to abandon their city. Or they were all eaten alive by the process. Potato, potato at this point. The process itself, at least, is very obviously something that's related to computing and software in some way. Cloudbank being a virtual world would also explain where all the data comes from that you can see, like how many cars are on a road or how many dreams were inspired at a beautiful vista. Though this could be an effect of you holding the transistor itself, which is what I assumed at first, it being heavily linked to the process and named as the brush that can shape Cloudbank to its will or whatever. All in all, it could make sense and would support why Red chooses to join the voice guy in the transistor itself, since the voice guy can't get out of the transistor anymore. Or it could just be some fucked up dystopia setting in real life, where rampant growth and expectations have to be met by using unknown artifacts or something, and the entire world being digitalized because of cyber stuff or whatever. I don't know for sure, but it's a cool theory regardless. Not that it really matters in the end anyways, since this is simply a story about revenge. And at the end, after defeating the last of the Camerata, instead of continuing the fight against the process and becoming the savior and shaper of Cloudbank with newfound abilities of the transistor, Red chooses instead to give up and join her lover in the transistor space itself. And this all makes the conclusion of the story quite a lot more human, I suppose. All in all, Transistor is definitely a unique experience when it comes to Supergiant Games, and it definitely feels like a more modern game than Bastion did. Its interesting combat in a beautiful world with an intriguing setting and story, backed by amazing music, definitely makes Transistor worth its while, which is kind of what I've come to expect from Supergiant Games titles. Thanks for watching this third video on the Supergiant games, and hopefully you'll join me in the final video about Pyre next time, which will come sooner rather than later, hopefully, I promise.